Hello, everybody, and welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm Nick Palavita. I'll be your moderator for today's show. And today we have a very interesting topic. Apparently, your government is out to spend another $40 billion on just things. And with that, we're going to bring in first one of our commentators. You've seen him on World Edition, a CPA who may have problems with this and may not. We'll bring in Lee Newton Rhodes. Lee, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Nick. How are you? You already had a mouthful to talk about with what you said.
It's only $40 billion. And with that, the person who monitors what goes on in Washington, hopefully trying to create some semblance of fiscal responsibility, which I'm not going to say we haven't seen in a long time. I'd have to say we've never seen. We'll bring in the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. David, welcome to the show. You're the one who tipped me off on this. $40 billion? On what? What are we getting for it? Oh, they don't ask those questions in Washington.
Well, firstly, good to see you and Nick. And Lee, you might need to trim that hedge right behind you after this. But in any event, it looks like it's federal spending out of control. But let's talk about the $40 billion. President Biden has proposed a supplemental spending bill for fiscal 2023. As you know, fiscal 2023 ends on September 30th, 2023. So just a little over a month away. And he wants to spend another $40 billion on three things. Number one, disaster aid. I'll come back to that. Number two, border security. And number three, Ukraine. So let's take them one at a time. On disaster recovery aid, that's legitimate. That's needed. We've had a number of significant disasters within the last couple of months, the biggest one arguably being Maui, the terrible fires in Maui. We also had a lot of flooding in California and that region of the country as well. And so as long as that is properly handled, then I think it's justified, and I think Congress will end up acting on it. It doesn't help when you have FEMA officials staying in 4- and 5-star hotels in Maui, presumably to try to be able to help people who are homeless. That is totally inappropriate. It's outrageous, and they'll have to get to the bottom of that. But, there is a legitimate need there. The second is border security. Well, that's an oxymoron under this administration. There is no border security under this administration. The border is not secure. It's not wide open, but it's definitely not closed. We're not requiring people to go through the normal ports of interest. Thousands of people every day are crossing the border illegally, in many cases facilitated by drug cartels who are engaging in both drug trafficking and human trafficking. The administration is not discharging their constitutional responsibilities to be able to protect and defend our borders. And yet, at the same point in time, when states try to do things when the federal government fails to do things, the federal government sues them, which is totally outrageous. And so we've got a situation where if we're going to provide more money for the border, it needs to be for security, not how it's being used. It's being used right now to be able to process and distribute illegal immigrants throughout the United States, which is causing a huge strain on many cities, including cities that are run by Democratic mayors who are now finally starting to complain about the failure of the federal government to do their job. Now, in many cases, they just want more money. That's not the answer. The answer is secure the border. The other thing I found out within the last 2 weeks by somebody who's on the front line down there is that the administration is selling all this steel that was purchased by the last administration to build a wall at pennies on the dollar. Pennies on the dollar. Things are just out of control. The other thing we need to do is we need to recognize reality. These cartels are terrorist organizations. What they're doing to our national security and our public health is unacceptable. it's time to declare them to be terrorist organizations. And it's time to tell the Mexican government that either you do what's necessary to neutralize these people or we'll do what's necessary to neutralize these people. And I have no problem giving money for that. The last issue is, the issue of Ukraine. And this is a more complicated issue. And we saw a little bit of this play out in the GOP presidential debate last week. First, clearly, Russia is on the wrong side of this issue. They invaded a sovereign nation. They are engaging in a number of atrocities, and that is totally unacceptable. But we also need to recognize how this thing got started and what our appropriate role is. This got started arguably when in 2014, during the Obama-Biden administration, Russia took Crimea and absolutely nothing was done. In addition, with our disastrous exit from Afghanistan 2 years ago, that emboldened Russia, China, and others to be able to take more aggressive actions. Furthermore, when the president answered a question asking about what he would do if Russia invaded Ukraine, and his answer was, well, it depends upon the nature of the incursion, that pretty much gave Russia the green light to go and take part of Ukraine that was largely Russian speaking, and the Donetsk and other reasons, if you will, to create a land bridge to Crimea. But now we're in a situation where rather than trying to deter aggression, and let me reinforce, to deter aggression, you have to do things before the aggression occurs, not after the aggression occurs. We did not do enough with regard to arming Ukraine and taking a number of other steps to deter Russian aggression. So when it occurred, now we're trying to make up for lost time. We're late, on many of the things that we're offering, but nonetheless, we are doing way more than our fair share. We have contributed way more than European nations combined. Now let's go to the debate that was last week, the presidential debate. Nikki Haley took on Vivek on his position in Ukraine. Vivek says we shouldn't give any more money to Ukraine. I disagree with that. I think we should, with conditions. Nikki said there are 11 nations in Europe that have given a higher percentage of their GDP than we have. Well, now this is a typical politician. Technically accurate, grossly misleading. Technically, as of May 2023, there were 11 small European nations, for the most part, that had given a higher percentage of their GDP to Ukraine aid than we had. But guess what? Countries like Germany, France, Italy, much bigger nations are way behind us, such that we have given much more in total dollars and as a percentage of our GDP than European nations combined. Now, what's going to change this? Well, let me give you a magic principle, and that is called incentives. We ought to tell the Ukrainians that we're going to continue to help them because we want them to prevail, although, as I've said before, I think it's much more likely to end in a stalemate. But we want to help them. But here's what the deal is going to be. We will match what European nations give. In other words, we're not going to continue to be Uncle Sugar. We're not going to continue to write blank checks. We will match what the other European nations give. We've already given a lot more than them. Forget about that. That's water, over the dam or under the bridge, whatever you want to say. But from this point forward, we're going to match. So if that $24 billion is going to be enacted, it ought to be. If it's going to be passed, it ought to be passed with conditions. It's matching money. We're not giving this unrestricted. It's matching money. So those are just a few thoughts. Happy to get into those or anything else you want to get into, Nick. And thanks for giving me a chance to kind of set the table.
Hey,
Yeah, well,
David, just really quickly. I just had a quick question for David, and it actually was based on some of what he was talking about and the debate and all along those lines. But I know that we're going to come up on Labor Day, and the holiday season, believe it or not, isn't that far from us, and all along those lines. So a lot of people are concerned because that is usually a time that gas prices start going back up and inflation starts being an issue and everything. So I just wondering whether we should be concerned. I know that the U.S. Federal Reserve Chief Jerome Powell has left the door open for further increases in interest rates and all in that space. But I just wonder, where do you think we are in the United States, and particularly in this part of the West, when it comes to inflation numbers, and whether this is something that we will be seeing as a concern in even the political lanes? Because I know a lot of times people are like hearing all these other issues and they're going like, no, that's really the economy. I think that I read a comment where folks were wanting the candidates to speak more on economic solutions when they were in the debates that we just had the last Wednesday and everything, because I was reading a couple articles and a couple of the people afterwards were like, I heard a lot of things around climate change. I heard a lot of things around a number of other issues. I want to know, what are you going to do to help me put bread in my pantry?
Well, first, gas prices are already on the rise. And I think when you saw what happened with regard to the BRICS meeting, where they invited 7 other nations to join them in an alliance against U.S. interests, including a potentially alliance against the dollar. And a lot of those nations that were invited to be there were oil-producing nations. So I think there's increasing sentiment that over time, oil prices are going to go up. That's obviously one driver of inflation, because people don't realize that it's not just what you pay at the pump for your gas, but petroleum products are critical with regard to agriculture, plastics, many other things, if you will. So it flows throughout. Plus, moving goods from one place to another requires fuel. And the dates that have been set by California and the federal government and others to try to be able to get to the date of all electric vehicles are just outrageous. They don't even pass a straight face test. There's no way that can. Now, with regard to Jerome Powell, we're over 3% inflation. Their target rate is 2%. It's come down significantly from the 9% in June of last year, but it's still above their target. Some people are trying to get him to raise his target from 2% to 3%. He's rejected that. He's going to stick with 2%. He basically gave the signal that while we've made progress, we're still in excess of the target. He's committed to that target. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see another 25 basis point or 0.25% increase the next time they meet. Now we've got a situation where the federal government is paying over 5% for interest, and it was paying a little over 2% just 2 years ago. For each 1% in interest on $30 trillion in debt, that's real money, $300 billion. Okay, so 2 times that is $600 billion on top of what we were already paying. We're in a situation now where interest is not only the fastest growing expense. Very shortly, it's going to pass total spending on national defense and many other programs that the federal government has. So I think number one issue for the voters for the 2024 election is economics. That is number one. There's a number of other things that are important, but that is by far number one. And if you look at the percentage of time that was spent in the last presidential debate on the GOP side, they talked about a lot of issues. They did talk about economics, but not nearly as much as they should have, given the fact that's the number one issue. In addition, there was not enough specifics. What are you going to do? And I wrote an op-ed that got published in the Washington Times on Friday of this past week that not only talked about this new $40 billion proposal, but also talked about what do we have to do to deal with the disease. The fact that we are spending way more money than we should, and that we have mounting debt burdens as a percentage of our economy that's going to undercut our future economic growth opportunity, economic security, national security, and domestic tranquility if we don't do something about it. And I offer specific solutions. We hear a lot about the problems. We don't hear enough about solutions. Last thing on this, Vivek is a very bright guy, very bright, very articulate, and has a number of ideas. There's one big problem with Vivek. He's incredibly naive. He's incredibly naive about what it takes to be able to get things done in Washington, D.C., and he's got no experience whatsoever with regard to government. And while there are a lot of transferable skills and abilities from the private sector and the not private sector to government, it is a whole different ball game. And don't kid yourself. It is.
Speaking of naive and all along those lines and everything, and then I'll be quiet and definitely let our other great folks speak in all that space. I sometimes get frustrated, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this around the building that is going on. I mean, I live in Durham, it's the Research Triangle Park, and we have seen a boom in buildings, but there are not enough people going into the building. So like we're getting apartment complexes all over the place here in Durham. We're getting buildings that are being built left and right and everything. And I'm going like, I get it that you want to have a building boom. It's not just here. I would argue that it's even where Lee is in New York and everything. And I'm going like, you're building the buildings, but are there actually tenants to go into the buildings? Otherwise, why are we having this big building boom that is supposed to be one of our backbones of our economy and all in that space? But I'd love to hear your thoughts around that, Dave, because I know that it's even happened there in the Virginia DC corridor as well and everything. But I sometimes get frustrated when I see all these great buildings going up, and I know that they are in some cases like that 25% occupancy, which is not a good amount of occupancy for a building that is going up and all in that space.
Well, Mark, I just hope that one of the real estate funds that I invest in is not building those properties you're talking about. But let's talk about the issue real quick. There's lots of things going on. COVID-19 things changed things forever in many ways, and one of the things that it changed is a significant increase in the amount of working virtually as compared to the past. My personal view is people ought to be in the office for most jobs 3 days a week, even if you could work remotely. And there are some jobs you can't work remote because you need to be able to have interaction. You need to be able to deal with other people. That promotes innovation. That promotes many, many different things. All right. So Class A office space, especially downtown, has been hit hard. And you see a lot of those being converted into housing, if you will. At the same point in time, we know we've got trends where people are moving out a lot of the big cities. They're moving from the north to the south, all right? North Carolina benefits from that, not as much as some other states like Virginia, like Florida, Tennessee, Texas, South Carolina, for various reasons, but it does benefit from that. And so that's what you're seeing going on. Hopefully these people are prudent where they're doing appropriate analysis to be able to understand what the demand is likely to be, if not immediate, over a period of time, such that those will be viable development projects. But I can't comment on the specific ones you're dealing with there. But those are some of the macro trends that we're seeing.
David, a macro trend that I didn't hear, and maybe you did in the debate. Did any of the media mention at all the $31 trillion in debt the United States is, and what the plan of these politicians are to deal with it? Did you hear any?
Not that I recall, but now we're about at $33 trillion. Okay. And as we've talked about before, that $33 trillion is really just the tip of the iceberg because it doesn't count unfunded Social Security, Medicare, civilian and military pensions, retiree health care, and a few other things. So the real number is over 125 trillion and growing faster than the economy. But that's my point. The number one issue for the Americans, I can't hear you, you're muted. The number one issue for Americans is economic, all right? There's lots of aspects of economic, but one of which is our structural imbalance and how are we going to get it back? And I propose two things. Number one, the debt ceiling is a dismal failure. It has failed to constrain the growth of government spending and mounting debt burdens. It needs to be repealed and replaced with a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt as a percentage of GDP we can take on absent extraordinary and circumstances for temporary periods of time. Secondly, that if you think that Congress is going to pass all the spending, tax, and other reforms necessary to be able to get us on a more sane and sustainable fiscal path, focusing on getting debt to GDP down to reasonable and sustainable levels. If you think they're going to do that through the regular order in a piecemeal fashion, you are dreaming. It will never happen. And therefore, we need a new statutory commission where you've gotten buy-in from the Congress and the president that learns the lessons from Simpson-Bowles, that engages the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, that comes back and makes a package of recommendations that will be guaranteed an up or down vote in Congress. The people are smarter than the politicians. They're ahead of the politicians. You have to prepare the way for a tough vote, but we need that tough vote sooner rather than later, but in my view, after the next election. So those are two concrete things, and we can get into specific issues, Social Security, et cetera, but we have to recognize reality that things are broken. The regular order is not working. We've got to be creative and find out other ways to be able to deal with these problems before it's too late.
Yeah. But David, why wasn't this even part of the debate? You'd think that these topics that we're discussing are important to everybody. Social Security going broke next decade, Medicare going broke this decade, the United States 33 trillion in debt, plus all these unfunded liabilities. Shouldn't this be the first issue on the table rather than climate change or border issues? And this important.
Well, I would respectfully suggest that the candidates in many cases are not going to bring it up, and so therefore the moderators have the obligation to bring it up, and it should be one of the first questions that they ask, and they should have ask follow-up questions as necessary to get people to provide a real answer. Candidly, I think this is an opportunity for a candidate. I think it's an opportunity for a candidate to take this issue on, provide real leadership, commit to engage with the American people. Social Security in particular, the two leading candidates for president, Biden on the Democratic side and Trump on the Republican side, have both said that they're not going to touch Social Security, which means that they support a 20% plus benefit cut in 10 years. That's what it means. And we need to hoist them by their petards for that, because that is laggardship, not leadership. It is totally unacceptable. It is one of the reasons that we are where we are. Too many laggards, not enough leaders.
Yeah. Another stat that was pulled out by the media, which I had to fact check because I couldn't believe it, 25% of all of our national debt, all of it, was accrued during the Trump administration. Would that be somebody who would be fiscally responsible when he has a history of not being fiscally responsible with his companies? Not that I want to bring up another bad.
I think the answer to that is no. Okay. But I think the facts speak loudly. But let's also note that Biden's not fiscally responsible. Let's also note that the last two presidents that were fiscally responsible were Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush. Those were the last two presidents that were fiscally responsible. Nobody since then has been. Right.
Another thing is that when countries' GDP debt exceed the GDP, they end up running into some very serious problems. And I'm talking Japan, Greece, Spain. When does this whole problem of the debt massively exceeding the GDP create that economic bind that happened to Japan, the collapse in Greece, and the collapse in Spain?
Well, we already have debt to GDP over 100%. And if you count the debt held by the trust funds, which is guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States government and by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, it's well over 120% of GDP and growing much faster than the economy. Well, one of the consequences of that is you get a lot slower economic growth, which is what we're getting. We're getting a lot slower economic growth. With less economic growth, you have less opportunity. We get a lot higher interest expense, okay, because and as a result, we're now seeing our fastest growing expenses for something we get nothing for, which is interest. It constrains our ability to make needed investments. You know, we're spending too much on consumption, not enough on investments. But let me give you a footnote here. Investments doesn't just mean spending money on something. It means spending money on something that had an impact over multiple generations where you expect you will generate a positive rate of return. You know, that's not what a lot of these politicians understand. They just say, I want to spend money on something. Like, for example, climate change. Climate change is real, all right? Man contributes to climate change. But on the other hand, we need to recognize that we've got to transition to alternative energies over a much longer time frame than these people are talking about. The other thing that we have to realize is that many of the key ingredients necessary to be able to build, electric vehicles and the batteries that power the electric vehicles are in China. They're in China. You know, we don't, who is an adversary to ours. So, you know, we need to think longer term. We need to think in a more strategic and integrated fashion in order to be able to address a lot of these challenges that face our nation.
David, just really quickly, 55 years ago today, there was a very powerful speech that was made by a great moral leader, and all along those lines, and he talked about a group of folks that are still out there and that are still very much in the need of being recognized and being helped. And I don't know that many poor folks that can afford a electric car or can actually get an electric car, and all along those lines. And there are 40 million, is the last statistic I heard, or something around that neighborhood, million poor and low income people in the nation. So to Nick's point and everything, I didn't hear anybody even allude to or acknowledge the fact that in 1968 was the March on Washington. That was what I was referring to. And Martin Luther King was actually talking about the great economic divide that existed then. I would argue that it still exists. So I did not hear any conversation among those Republican candidates, and I will absolutely agree with you that I haven't heard that much among the Democratic candidates either about what they're going to do with this divide that existed then and still exists some 55 years later. So I was wondering your thoughts about that, and am I wrong in thinking that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with by our political folks, or at least have a conversation around, because there are a lot of folks that are fitting in that category. And it was definitely, like I said, today, August 28th, is literally the anniversary of that speech.
My understanding is it was 60 years ago today, Mark, rather than 55 years ago today. I think it was 1963, if I'm not mistaken.
You're correct. You're correct.
And I will tell you that I have even greater respect for Martin Luther King today. And as time goes on, he was a man way ahead of his time. He was also a man who tried to pull people together rather than divide people apart. He was a man that promoted protest, but non-violent protest. He was a man who said that we ought to judge people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And I hate to tell you, we're not following his advice. We are not following it, and shame on us, okay? But look, the other thing that's going on, look, great progress has been made on civil rights. Do we still have a way to go? Yes. That's why the Constitution says that we're always striving to form a more perfect union. We will never be perfect, but we also have to recognize we got to compare ourselves to others. You don't know how good or bad you have it until you know how you compare to others. And I get frustrated with some members of Congress. They're complaining. They come from countries they'd never go back to. All right, but they seem to think that we're worse than where they came from, which is obviously true. So look, you're right, not enough. There is a great divide.
Yeah.
But let me clear it. The rich are getting richer.
Mm-hmm.
The gap between the rich and the poor has grown. The middle class is the one that's getting squeezed.
Yeah.
Because the wealthy is going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of social insurance and welfare programs for the poor. Over 40% of people don't pay any income taxes at all at the federal level. Over 20% of people not only don't pay any income taxes, but they get a rebate through refundable tax credits. So the people that are going to get squeezed more and more initially are the middle class. And then ultimately, if we don't put our finances in order, the poor are going to be affected because the social safety net is going to get shredded. We need to act sooner rather than later to avoid that.
So in terms of, I mean, just speaking on that squeeze, the issue that always comes up is that we point out that 40% and pointing to the poor that aren't paying, but then that 40% becomes demonized. And then we start to look at those SNAP programs and everything else and education programs that deal with those individuals, those investments, which are very tangible and can help our society. But we never really point out that 40% that gets that money or that needs that money in those SNAP programs is a very small cry from the corporations who get not only the subsidies but the same kickbacks. One company gets the more than actually that program has. So you get these companies and these rich individuals. So how do we shift the mindset that, okay, well, we're going to work for the middle class, but we've got to understand that we've got that burden that's really, here that we never complain about, but we always complain about this 40%. So how do we shift the mindset of the country to stop attacking the poor and really not really even attack the rich, but get people to understand that putting in their fair share helps out?
All right, well, let's clarify certain things. Over 40% of individuals who file federal tax returns pay zero income tax. They pay payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare, but they get something for that. All right, their social insurance program. About 20% of the people who file federal income tax returns individually get a rebate. So not only do they not pay taxes, they get money back. All right. The poverty rate in the United States is nowhere close to 40%. It's not even 20%. All right. So the bottom line is that I have no problem whatsoever for people who are at or below, or maybe even somewhat near the poverty rate, not having to pay, much in income tax. I have no problem with that. Okay. That's not where we're at. We're way beyond that. The second thing is that you point out properly is we have two kinds of spending. We have direct spending, which is money going out, right? And we have backdoor spending. Backdoor spending is where the federal government gives a tax preference, gives a deduction, gives an exemption, gives a credit, gives an exclusion. We have over 1.5, I think it's 1.5 to 1.7 trillion in tax preferences, both on the individual side and the corporate side. That's spending. That needs to be much more visible, both in the financial statements as well as part of the annual budget process. Those need to be reformed. They need to be dramatically reduced, much more targeted, as one way to try to restore fiscal sanity, as a way to make the tax code a lot simpler, to make it fair, and to reduce the pressure to have to increase tax rates for everybody. So, yeah, you make a good point, and I've been talking about that for a lot of years. So,
real quickly, it's a pleasure to be here today. Wearing my NC State sweatshirt because my son started NC State.
Good luck, Steve.
Yeah, innovative university. But real quickly, my only 2 points I would make today is that to sum up everything David Walker said about innovation, the debt, and then also tying in Dr. King's message is, to me, a game-changing moment in my life was seeing India become the fourth nation to land a spacecraft on the moon and the first on the lunar pole. And I want to remind everyone listening to this program that when my late father-in-law saw Neil Armstrong walk on the moon, that actually inspired him and many Indians to come to the United States because they wanted to live in a nation that could execute the vision of an assassinated President John F. Kennedy, who challenged our nation. Why do we go to the moon? Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And I think it's really interesting now to watch a nation where every day we're talking about Donald Trump's indictments. We've divided this nation, polarized on both extremes of the party. We're spending way too much money. We're not looking at even the Chandrayaan mission to the moon was done very frugally compared to, it still cost probably about $1 billion, but a lot less expensive than what other nations spend for space travel. So I think this is a real eye-opener for the United States of America. And I now believe more than ever, I disagree with Shaquille Latimer. I think Narendra Modi and India is primed to be the next #1 economy in the world. I think the Prime Minister of India knows it. I think he's working hard to get to it. And John Chambers, who quite frankly, if Chambers says it, usually it's true. I mean, this is a guy that survived 8 downturns. And I just spoke to John a few days ago, and he's still, through text we spoke, he's still adamant that India gets it right. But I think it's something for all of us to look at. Why are we not thinking big in America anymore? Right? Why would some immigrant leave India, like my father-in-law, to come to the United States if his own country now is going to execute that vision? So that's my 2 cents today. But I think it's a real eye-opener for the United States of America, and I think we need to have someone running for the presidency, quite frankly, that's challenging us.
Yeah.
That's pushing us to think big, and I don't see it right now.
Steve, I take a look at the CEOs for the top 10 companies in America. You will see a disproportionate number of Indian Americans as CEOs, and India is an up and coming country. Absolutely, there's no question about that. They're also a key country to keep your eye on, because historically they've had pretty close relations to Russia, not with China. You know, they've had border battles before, if you will. But I think India is one of the key countries, up and coming countries, and it's one that we need to have closer relations with, than we do today, in my view. And yeah, I mean, Vivek is of Indian heritage. Okay, I've got a lot of friends of Indian heritage, including you. Okay, and there's a lot of value there. My only point is, there's 2 things you have to do. You have to talk about what do we need to do, but you also have to recognize how you're going to get it done. Because if you don't address both of those things, it's pie in the sky.
Rick,
I agree with Steve that the U.S. has 4% of the world's population. We have always succeeded by recruiting the best and the brightest of the other 96% of the world. And, if India becomes India has 4 times our population, China 4 times our if they become places where you can do entrepreneurial stuff and live large the way you used to do it in the U.S., then yeah, people are going to stay there. They're going to get educated here, go back. And if what you see in other countries are stories about, like the guy with the swastikas on his AR-15 who went and shot up a bunch of black people, that, if the U.S. is full of what looks like danger and nonsense, then yeah, we're going to lose that world talent. Right after World War II, the U.S. had 90% of the world's manufacturing capacity because Europe was in ruins. And
50% of global GDP.
I just want to say that the big thing that Steve, you touched on about India, which, I believe they'll be that next big up and coming, is because they are becoming that #1 tech hub, and technology is where the future is. We can talk about everything else, but AI, robotics, and everything else, and all that, India has been at the forefront of a lot of this stuff. And Steve talked about the moon landing. That moon landing was for the amount that they did it for. I mean, that is impressive, very impressive. So yeah, I completely what Steve was talking about.
Look what I got in the mail, guys. Look what I got in the mail yesterday with a note from Joe Biden. That wasn't signed by the president, but it's just my dad. And by the way, I'm a moderate Democrat, but my dad's a Republican. Apparently, my mother told me, I texted this to my father, and it made him. He doesn't want to have dinner with me.
Hey, Steve, just on a micro level, just on a micro level, not a macro level. It was really good this past weekend, as many of y'all know. In addition to being part of the leadership team here on Pod TV, I am also a proud employee of the Heritage Center, and we have a youth camp that it runs year round. And I can tell you that this last week there were several kids that were learning how to fly drone planes, because the first 2 weeks of the camp were around STEAM and STEM, so they were actually learning how to maneuver those drones. And the week before, they were learning robotics and all in that space. So that was just good to see in that kind of line. And by the way, apparently he came to, and I know not everybody here is a big fan of him and all along those lines, but I do know that Josh Stein spoke at the kind of King celebration at the one of our major churches here in Durham, and apparently got some good support from that event that he was at and all along those lines. So he was definitely reaching out to the African American community by going to one of the larger churches here in Durham. And like I said, I've talked to a couple of friends that went, and they said that he did a very good job in that space. And then I'll just mention this really quickly, because the speech that I was actually referring to wasn't so much the March on Washington, but in '68, which was the one 55 years ago, is something that Lee sometimes talks about, because apparently Dr. Martin Luther King and many others called for a revolution of values in America at that particular time. And that's when the Poor People's Campaign was actually launched. And I know there's a new Poor People's Campaign that Reverend Barber is part of, but I'm talking about the initial one was in that '68 time frame. So I don't know if Lee's got any thoughts about a revolution of values being needed in 2023.
100%. Lacking sorely in America today. Go
Yeah.
on, Dave.
Let me remind you that over 2/3 of Americans do not want Donald Trump or Joe Biden to run for president in 2024.
That's right.
And the fact is that we need more options for very different reasons. The American people don't want either one of them. And I think if the parties don't start recognizing that reality, they will get a third option because the people deserve a third option. Let me just mention, one of the challenges we have today is that this country has strayed from the principles and values under which it was founded and that made us great. And we're not perfect, and we never will be. We need to continue to strive for a more perfect union. But we were founded on such principles as limited but effective government, individual liberty and opportunity, personal responsibility and accountability, rule of law and equal justice under the law, fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity, and stewardship. We're failing on all of those. So we need to get back to what make this country great. And we need to not just focus on today, but also what do we need to do to create a better tomorrow. And we need to, among other things, dramatically reform our immigration laws, dramatically reform them. Yes, we need talent for certain types of jobs that are seasonal that Americans don't want to do, but we need more of the best and brightest. And we need to be able to make sure that our immigration policies are focused disproportionately on enabling us to be able to continue to draw the best and brightest, because that's at risk right now.
In terms of that, just two quick things. We did talk a lot glowingly about Vivek Ramaswamy a couple of times, but he's a horrible person. Horrible person. We're on the anniversary of the march that Mark talked about, and just yesterday he was in an interview talking about how he doesn't believe racism is real. So, and there's just a whole bunch of bad stuff behind him. While he can speak glowingly, he also caters to the crowd and has some bad stuff. But on the touch thing, because I completely agree with Dave about the reforming the immigration law, but I think that's only piece. We also need people. We need to somehow get more people in Nick's profession into the actual immigration law, so we can lessen that line, because we can reform the laws, but we'll still have that line without having judges, lawyers, and other individuals to take care of those individuals that are trying to come through or trying to go through that pathway to citizenry. But if we don't have people to help them or work with them, that line is still going to be bad, and we're still going to have the same conversations.
100 years ago, 14% of Americans were foreign born. Today, it's still 14%. We're not being overwhelmed. The parties, they love fighting over immigration and not solving immigration.
Thank you.
Yeah, but the problem is there's a difference between legal and illegal immigration.
Sure.
And
But
we
when we
we are
got
not
negative,
we are
we
not
got
we are
negative.
not. Pardon me. We are not recognizing that right now.
Okay,
I
but
think
we
we
have
are.
negative without
Order,
immigration.
I've been there.
We have negative population growth.
Oh, I
America,
understand. I understand all of that. I understand. And but all the more reason why you got to reform it. But you also are penalizing people that are playing by the rules, who are coming through the approved points, who are applying for asylum, who are waiting.
You just have to present yourself to the border to apply for asylum. So any point on the border can technically be a point
Actually,
of
not.
entry.
You're supposed to go through an approved border entry point. That's actually
I thought,
not.
of course,
You by definition, you have violated the law if you don't come across on an official border crossing point. Yeah.
What's happened is that after Trump, it does look like foreign immigrants, legal immigrants, is down compared to other nations like Canada and on Europe, and many of these European countries, including Canada, are making it easier to come, and Germany as well, what they call merit-based immigration. So people can come in there, get their visas or their work permits, and go work. So this is going to hurt the U.S. But I think we're not addressing the illegal immigration. I think because we're not, it's become used as a political football now. Neither side is motivated to make anything happen. I think the longer we do that, though, it's going to hurt. I mean, I talked about India, not because I'm so bullish on India, but what's interesting is 60% of the population is under 26 years of age. So that's good news globally for the U.S. and the rest of the world, because that global talent, which is going to drive the economy, fill the new jobs, will come from another nation, and we'll harness that capability. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, will the best and brightest continue to come here, or will the next Google, Zoom, Yahoo, Zoom be started in some other part of the country, the world?
It's already past China in population.
Until we address the people taking care of the people coming to the border, we're still going to have the line, and we're still going to have illegal immigration. We're still going to have undocumented workers coming across. We just don't have the people in those positions. That's another problem that we're not addressing.
Well, the problem too is you're not making people accountable for hiring those undocumented workers, and then they use them as slaves. And this has been happening forever. And, but we started this problem by bringing over cheaper labor. The rich people did it. The politicians did it. And it's continued. But I think one of the ways that you can do it is kind of the way that we used to welcome people into our country to become citizens, is you make them go to some classes, you make them walk through a system, and then you tell them you're going to pay your taxes just like everyone else. You're going to pay for your college education just like everyone else. You're going to pay your way in this country, because freedom isn't free. And we have to pay for it. I have to pay for it. Middle class, you guys talk about the poor and the rich. The middle class is a rubber band that is being stretched beyond its capability to maintain this country. And it's the middle class that takes care of this country. And we are not looking after their best interests. Yeah. And one of the biggest problems I'm having right now is why the interest rates are
rising, growing middle class,
and hurting the back of the middle class, and hurting the students who have paid their way through school and cannot no longer afford the student debts that are piling up on their backs right now. So this is we're not focused on the problems, like Steve said, because we're so easily turned. And I think even Rick said this, we're so easily turned to all the angst and attitude and hate and trials and everything. We're not focused on the real problems. And we need to start doing that. We need to stand up. And I thank David for taking that bull by the horn and trying to show that we can make a difference. And I just think more of us need to do that.
Yeah. I think the student loan thing. That's a whole issue of greed on.
That's another issue. But what I'm saying is the immigration. We need to start taking account of people coming in.
Yep.
We need to document them. We need to tax them. And we say, yeah, okay, you can come in, but you got to take the classes. You got to learn our language. We're not learning yours anymore. You're learning ours. We're not hiring attorneys for you. And here's the process. And this way, they don't get taken advantage of. They don't become slaves or sex trade or anything else in this country. They become documented, healthy employees and part of our system. And we don't do that. We don't.
Where does the money for those individuals coming across the border come from?
They're going to have to bring their own.
So then you're talking about individuals who are impoverished and seeking shelter, seeking asylum. Then you're saying that they have to pay all this money and these finances, which they cannot afford in the first place.
Well, most of our people can't either. You're talking about the SNAP programs, and we have a lot of people who live in the
SNAP program is paid for
anyway. But you're bringing in impoverished people anyway and letting them slip under the rope. So you might as well document it. Document
it, yes. But so for example, the process it becomes expensive, and if you miss a date, it gets even more expensive.
It gets more expensive either way.
But a lot of those individuals, because if we're trying to figure a solution, and this goes back to, this is why I hate to harp back on I completely agree with the accountability. I completely agree with, trying to get everybody documented. But again, I come back to, we need individuals in these positions to take care of these lines, because if you have a individual that crosses the border, one that can't pay for all this stuff, but still needs to be processed and recorded and actually worked with. If they have a date that they can't even make it to, then you're saying that this person who's seeking asylum or seeking refuge or actually trying to come across even legally can no longer afford to legally do that.
Like, do you want it legal or illegal?
Come on.
Legal or illegal? It doesn't matter.
Here's the problem. They're not in a line.
No, there's a line.
No. They're coming across the border illegally. They should be sent back. Hold on. They're coming across the border. If they're in the line and they're coming through an approved border crossing, fine. If they're not following the normal process for asylum, fine. That's not what's happening. Have you been to the border? I've been there. It is an absolute unmitigated disaster. You have people coming across the border that have no legitimate asylum claim whatsoever. Asylum is for political asylum. It is not for economic opportunity. And what is this administration doing? They're not protecting the border. They're spending more money on processing and distributing people throughout the United States. They're giving them a date to come for a court case 7 to 10 years out. You think they're going to show up?
Why? But David, you're making my point. You're making my point exactly. If they're
crossing the border like bears cross the street, they don't know any better. They don't know any better.
So
they're just looking for a home, just like the bears and the deer in my backyard. The deer don't know the border.
Don't forget the antelope.
They don't care.
But Dave, I think you're making my point for me. You're saying that they're.
I want to close on this point.
Oh, I was just going to make it real quick. You're making my point for me, because what I'm saying is that we need more individuals to be able to help these individuals, because when they're crossing this border, just as Kim talks about, is they don't know what a border is. They don't know what a port of entry is. They're poor. They're searching for help. And then you're saying only political asylum is what people can leave for. Well, okay, if an individual is there, if their daughter is being raped and their son is being forced into a gang, they're trying to escape and take their 13-year-old who's being raped by a gang member and their son who's 8.
I hate to tell you that happens.
Run drugs for the cartel.
That happens here too.
These individuals cannot.
Thank you, David.
That happens here too. I hate to tell you.
I get that, but you're saying that those individuals who are searching can't seek help?
Let's come back to one thing, and then we'll let Steve wrap it. Rule of law. the first thing you have to do is secure the border. And
But we
then
can't unless
do these other things.
we can't do that if we don't have the people to
You don't
do
understand. What you're asking is for more people to process more people, not to secure the border. You have to first secure the border.
Look, I've spoken to
75% of
Well,
Americans
yes.
believe in that. All right, Steve.
All right, Steve.
real quickly. My last point I'll make on this is that asylum has always been granted those countries who are coming here for persecution, torture, and it was granted. It started after World War II when many people from the Jewish faith were brought in from Poland and other nations of the world, even Russia. Now what's happened is people are coming in for reasons of seeking asylum, and we just don't have the resources to address those asylum cases. So I do think we've got to address how we streamline this immigration process, looking at the foreign policy reasons of why these people are coming in from Venezuela. They're leaving authoritarian dictatorships where they're being murdered and things like that. I think at the end of the day, though, it's also going to look. I've spoken to Senator Tillis and Congresswoman Ross about this. One's a Republican senior senator from North Carolina, one's a Democrat. And both of them have said that even using sophisticated drone technology can actually track where people are coming in through the border illegally, particularly the drug cartels, which are bringing in some of these things. It's not all over. So I think there are innovative. I don't think it's building a wall that the Mexicans are going to pay for. We knew that wasn't going to happen. But there has to be something done. And the fact of the matter is, no presidential administration in the last 12 years has addressed this issue, whether it's going back to Obama, going down to George Bush, going now to Trump and even Biden. Trump did try it, but it's not working. And of course, Vice President Harris, who's got the lowest approval ratings of any vice president, was given this task to order. And God, it sounds like she might become the president if Biden is reelected. There's a rumor floating out there that they're going to invoke the 25th, and she's going to be a president for 2 years, striking a deal that she's not going to run again. But I think that'll be very interesting to see what happens. Anyway. But that's my final take of the day. This is a significant issue, and it's going to require people from both parties coming along and providing a solution.
And with that, we're at the hour, so we do want to thank the Honorable David M. Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States, and our audience from around the world, Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.